couple years back, there was a pretty well-known pastor who was being interviewed about the current state of the church in the West. And the interviewer was asking this pastor why it seems like people aren't changing in the church. Like, we have all of these programs, but it doesn't feel like real change is happening. And the pastor thought for a moment, and he shared this story and insight of how one of the biggest problems that he sees within his church and the greater church as a whole is that people who are there, who attend, who participate, are coming with the need to be their best selves, to show up, to put on this facade, to make sure that their lives feel and look put together. And he said this, that he's like, people don't get it. And then this pastor went to an AA meeting and he noticed something. He was like, okay, they get it. Every time the meeting starts, when they say their name, I'm so-and-so, and I have an addiction. I'm an alcoholic. See, there's no judgment within the room or between the people that are there. Then the pastor had this insight where he said, everything there starts from an assumed place of brokenness, and that's it. See, we live in a time in history that feels incurably anxious, in a generation whose defining traits for so many is that of anxiety and depression and worry. Now, what if I told you that the cure for our anxiety starts with risk? Like, what if I told you that we have been fed a lie about how things should be that has led us to exactly where we are right now? See, we live in a photoshopped world, a selfie-curated world, a world where Visco has edited away every imperfection from our lives, every defect, every unhappy moment. And this desire, this pull to a life that looks perfect, that looks devoid of pain and disappointment, plays right into our ego. Like, let's be honest for a second. It feels good to have everything look good in our lives. And then you mix that in with things like social media. It's like, okay, actually it feels better. It feels really good to have our lives look better than those around us. Now, in a world that presents everyone's strength for everyone to see, it becomes a competition. See who can become the top, the first place, the fastest to the top, the greatest, the biggest, most successful, the largest following. And that makes us feel anxious. And all of this competition becomes the breeding place for things like anxiety or worry or depression. And this world, more and more, doesn't have the place for misfits, for those who don't fit in, for those who aren't cool by society or the world's standards, or really any sort of brokenness or imperfection isn't allowed to happen. And sadly, for many of us in our experiences, this is a little bit of an overgeneralization, but Christians have perfected this to an art form, where we curate our lives to make sure that we look righteous or holy, or if we're sharing something that's going on that's hard, we won't be fully honest about how bad it actually is. We just need to make sure everything looks put together, or that we look Christian enough. Now, this mode of being, this culture within most of our churches makes real community almost impossible. And we know this. We know in our heads that the only way that we can feel fully known is by being open and vulnerable. But if we know this, then why is vulnerability so hard for us? Now, in The Coddling of the American Mind, Jonathan Haidt makes 3 observations, or 3 great untruths, as he calls it, that are plaguing our culture. And I think that they are some of the reason that vulnerability is so hard for you and I. And these 3 great untruths are this: the untruth of fragility, that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker; the untruth of emotional reasoning, to always trust your feelings; and the untruth of us versus them, that life is a battle between good people on one side and evil people on the other. Now, first, the untruth of fragility. Now, this untruth is highlighted in our therapeutic moment, our inability to put up with difficulty, which is grounded in the untruth that we are fragile, that when stress is put on us, we might break. So what feels like the proper response to this? Let's just get rid of any and all stress. Boom, problem solved. But in reality, humanity is anti-fragile. It is actually through putting stress and pressure on us that we grow, that we overcome, that we mature. Just like a muscle put under too much stress, too much weight can't lift it. A muscle that isn't used will atrophy. But a muscle that is worked out and where more weight is added slowly over time, the muscle ends up growing. And real community and vulnerability is difficult and hard. So for many of us, we don't engage. When in reality, growth comes through the difficulty and the joy found in community. Now, second, the untruth of emotional reasoning. We are told in our society to trust our feelings. Like we live in a generation in the middle of a crisis of meaning, where the meaning of life is absent, and then the purpose of life becomes pleasure, becomes feeling good. Or to flip that language, the purpose of life ends up becoming avoiding pain. And vulnerability is the potential for causing us pain, so then we end up pushing away and avoiding it at all costs. And third, the untruth of us versus them, that the good life is good people and evil people. And this is where the biblical story helps us so much. We have the reason why the world is the way that it is, sin. And the reality that human beings are a mixed bag. They're a mix of the image of God, and they're also made from the dust. Our brokenness and divinity all packaged into one. And like the AA group, where we're not putting ourselves in the camps of good and bad people, but there's an assumed price of brokenness. Like that's where we should be coming from. That's where real community should happen. Now I want to toss it back to the group. Discuss, share the difficulties that stop us from engaging with community. And then we'll be back to talk about what Jesus invites you and I into today. In a culture of hiddenness, anxiety, and coddling, the response of the way of Jesus is that of vulnerability. Real, open, honest vulnerability. And that takes being and sharing our weaknesses with those we are in community with. Whenever we come together sharing our strengths, it breeds competition. But whenever we come together sharing our weaknesses, it breeds community. And this is the essence of vulnerability, sharing our weaknesses, being open. See, here's the thing. Openness requires of us vulnerability, the ability, actually even the willingness to be wounded, to be hurt. So that means that risk is the central issue of vulnerability, that there's no such thing as vulnerability without risk, either of total rejection or people thinking less of us, or of not having others take advantage of us sharing our responsibilities. The risk will always be there. And that is why the culture of safety and that of being non-judgmental is so crucial within community. And that is why loyal love, that love and commitment, that hesed that we talked about last time, that's the precursor to vulnerability. So we need that to then move on and be able to talk about vulnerability in the first place. And it's these types of environments that we want to foster. And that is why gossip is so detrimental. And we'll talk about gossip more in a future session, but gossip destroys community. Gossip is taking the vulnerability of others and turning it to our own advantage. And a cultural value that your community could have and could embody is this: trusting that this group is a perfectly safe place for me to be. One author had this to say about vulnerability. Vulnerability is not only the ability to risk being wounded, but is most often made manifest by revealing our woundedness, our brokenness, our crippled mess, our weaknesses, our failures, our inadequacies. I do not think that Jesus walked vulnerably among the outcasts and the crippled of the world purely as a sacrificial act. To the contrary, I suspect he did so because he preferred their company. It is only among the overtly imperfect that we can find community, and only over the overtly imperfect nations of the world that we can find peace. Our imperfections are among the few things that we human beings all have in common. And if Jesus the healer taught us anything, he taught us that the way to salvation lies through vulnerability. To take the form of a servant, a slave, to take the weight and judgment of all of our sin and shame on the cross, his most vulnerable state, and also his most victorious moment. The scriptural authors, when they're building out the illustration of Jesus being enthroned over the universe, Jesus becoming king, They do so through the image of Jesus being raised on the cross. Jesus becoming king through becoming his most vulnerable. And if we take Jesus as our example and his invitation to become someone who lives as he did in all of our lives, Jesus embodied vulnerability. He demonstrated that the greatest gift that you and I can give each other and the world is our own woundedness. The genuine healer has to be wounded. And it is only through being wounded that you can heal. And with that, we cannot heal without being willing, without taking the risk of being hurt. To participate in Jesus' healing mission to the world, the only way to do so is through vulnerability. And there can be no vulnerability without risk. No community without vulnerability, and no peace, actually more than that, ultimately no life that's truly life without community. But first, now let's pause and let's have a time of discussion. What do you think about Jesus' invitation for us to fight against the pull to hiddenness, provide a healing to ourselves and the world through vulnerability? And then we will come back to end this session with the practice, the application side for vulnerability. Now, what are some of the ways that you and I can respond to the invitation to vulnerability? Now, the first is by taking the risk and being vulnerable. See, that's the thing. In building the community, in building any sort of community, some brave soul always needs to start. It needs to be the one to start and initiate being vulnerable. Now, see, I'm a part of a group of guys, a group of husbands who meet roughly once a month to challenge and encourage each other around being good, Christ-like husbands. And it happens almost every single time that as we're talking, the first little bit is kind of a little bit more surface level. And then one person goes deeper. They either confess something or share an area of brokenness in their marriage or in themselves or a difficulty that they're having. And then the floodgates almost open where everyone is like resounding like, oh yeah, me too. Or it's like, I have this thing going on in my life. Vulnerability breeds vulnerability. And the first practice is being vulnerable in an area of weakness or hurt or brokenness within your life. Or confession, of naming something that is not the way that God intended it to be. And the second is to try and be an agent of healing throughout your week through risk, of participating with Jesus in bringing healing to the world, whether it's through buying someone a meal or through giving an encouragement to someone or through praying for healing. All of those require vulnerability, and even more than that, they all require risk and all bring healing to our broken world. Now I'll toss it back to you for some final thoughts and discussion, but this wraps up our third session in our community practice. And now tune in next time, as we'll be diving into the importance of diversity in a culture of tribalism. Peace.